Stoke, and welcome back to the Hungarian Heritage Podcast, Season 4. It means so much to have you here with me again, and if this is your first time tuning in, I'm so glad that you're here. This podcast has always been a journey, not just through Hungarian people, places, food, and culture, but through the heart of what connects us all, our stories, our memories, and the pride we carry in who we are and where we come from. This season, I'll be introducing you to new friends and revisiting familiar voices who share a passion for preserving and celebrating Hungarian heritage. Together, we'll reflect on how traditions are preserved and how our Hungarian identity evolves and how we can pass this rich culture to the next generation so it doesn't just live in the past, but thrives in the future. Each episode will continue to reflect the flavors passed down through generations to the stories that carry our pride and history. Some stories will make you laugh, others might bring a tear to your eye, but all of them will reflect the beauty of what it means to be part of the Hungarian experience. I am filled with enthusiasm and honor to continue this journey with all of you as we connect the circles of Hungarians around us and make this community, Hungarian heritage, stronger than ever. The year was 1956. My family made a decision that would change everything. Hungary was in the middle of a revolution, and for many families, staying was no longer an option. Among them was mine. Growing up, I always heard pieces of my family's story, little moments about leaving Hungary, about refugee camps, about starting over in America, but it wasn't until later that I realized what they had actually lived through. They left their home with almost nothing, not knowing if they'd ever return, not knowing what would happen next. What started as a fight for freedom quickly turned into a journey of escape, survival, and starting over in a new country. They crossed borders, lived in refugee camps, and eventually rebuilt their lives in America, built from scratch. In a time of political upheaval and fear, my family made the difficult decision to leave everything behind in search of freedom. This series of episodes is about that journey, what led them to leave, what they experienced along the way, and how it shaped everything that came after. This isn't just history. This is my family's story. This is the story of how it all happened and why they had no choice but to leave. But the story doesn't end when they arrive in America. It continues in the quiet, everyday moments, learning a new language, adapting to a different culture, and slowly becoming part of a new world while pieces of the old one begin to fade. Over time, there was distance, a loss of connection to the family and the life they had left behind. Until one day, unexpectedly, a letter arrived. A single piece of mail that reopened a door thought to be closed forever. But the door that opened with that letter wasn't ready to be opened yet. 20 more years would pass before a new letter would arrive, an email this time. That email led to reconnection, with family still in Hungary, with a past that hadn't disappeared, and with a piece of land that somehow was still ours. A small piece of something left behind that found its way back to us. And the Hungarian family that I longed for my entire life also found its way back. Welcome to Storytime, Part 1, where I read my family's immigration story from the book Hungarian Roots and American Dreams. The title of my family story in Hungarian Roots and American Dreams is called A List, a Letter, and the Land, a lifetime of loss, longing, and looking for reconnection. Leaving was thought to be forever, as the chaos, confusion, and conflict surrounding the 1956 uprising dictated many difficult decisions for people. In less than 24 hours, my grandmother, grandfather, and father fled Budapest on a typical weekday autumn morning after receiving dangerous news. My grandmother, Gisela was a Hungarian woman to the core with her innate duty to feed people. And 24 hours before her life would unknowingly change forever, she chose to feed sandwiches to resistance soldiers through the back door of the kitchen at the business where she worked. As a result, someone reported her actions and her name was put on the list in her boss's office. Luckily, my grandmother's friend, who also worked with her in the kitchen, brought the boss his lunch that day and saw my grandmother's name at the top of the list. After work that night, she shared what happened with my grandfather, and without hesitation, they prepared their escape for the next morning. They told no one of their plans, as they didn't want to raise any alarm or put other family members in danger. They didn't even tell my grandmother's aunt, who lived with them in their home. The morning of their escape, my grandparents and father dressed as usual for work and school. With the clothes on their backs and a briefcase stuffed with documents and family pictures, they left their home for the last time to save my grandmother's life, unsure whether they would or could ever return. My grandmother did not show up for work that day at the business where she cooked in the company kitchen. My grandfather did not show up at his coveted railroad job where he worked as a machinist, and my father did not show up for his second grade class at the school located 5 houses away from his home. Little did they know that the next 5 months would bring many changes and alter the trajectory of their lives forever. Growing up in Detsk, moving to Budapest, my grandmother's formative years. My grandmother, Gisela Ilona Ferenc, was born in 1928 and grew up in Detsk, a small village in Heves County. If you have ever eaten a Detski cake snack, they are made on the outskirts of that village. She was the fourth of 5 children. She had 2 older brothers, Sándor and Ferenc, an older sister, Margit, and a younger brother, György. She always said that her mother, also named Gisela, was a typical village woman who dressed in black and sometimes walked around without shoes. Her father, Sándor Ferenc, was the complete opposite. Although he also lived in Detsk, he would travel to the city of Budapest to work at his job at the railroad during the week. My grandmother would often speak of this country mouse versus city mouse scenario, and she always knew that although she loved her life in Detsk, she was not destined to live there forever. Little did she know how far from Detsk she would one day live. My grandmother, Gisela, loved to tell the stories of her life in Hungary, which seemed like a pretty typical life for a young child growing up in a village in the early part of the 20th century. She attended school, played with her friends, learned how to cook at her mother's side, and lived a happy life full of frolic and sometimes mischief, as she loved to recount the stories of playing with her friends and her older brother's friends. She would recount the days of lying in the field with her sister Margit as they ate watermelon and stared at the clouds in the sky. Her family also raised a few animals, grew vegetables in the garden, and grapes for wine. Typical for Hungarian families in the northeastern region of Hungary, her family also had a small winery, which was the topic of many of her shared stories. Village life for my grandmother was full of happiness and adventure until World War II began. My grandmother was a teenager when the war became an inescapable reality for Hungarian civilians. Gone were her days of freedom, as many of them were spent hiding from Red Army soldiers that were advancing through the Hungarian villages, creating an extremely unsafe situation for young girls. Sometimes she and her sister would hide in the barn loft. Their mother would bring them food and water, and her family would joke about how their mother was dripping water from the bucket as she walked, creating a direct line to where the girls were hiding. Eventually, my grandmother's uncle built a new headboard for one of the beds in the house that had a hollow space for her and her sister to hide. There was no longer the hope of continuing school for her, as she was supposed to continue on to finishing school, but the war had abruptly closed that chapter of her story. As the war continued, my grandmother eventually started spending the work weeks in Budapest with her father and older brothers, who also had jobs working for the railroad. Her family also had an apartment in the city, and she was there to help take care of the men in the family by cooking, cleaning, and doing the shopping while the men went to work. Her mother declined to move to Budapest, preferring life in the village to that of the city. My grandmother's voice was always full of pride and importance when she told the stories of this chapter in her young life as a teenager. There was more freedom of movement in Budapest compared to the isolation and danger for young girls who remained in the village. During this time, my grandmother also worked in the hosiery department of a store somewhere in Budapest while managing the household for her brothers and father. As a young woman who was not yet 18 years old, my grandmother experienced so much life between growing up in the peaceful village of Detk to living and working in Budapest through her formative years as a teenager during World War II. Some of my grandmother's learned experience might not have occurred had the war not broken out, and later the lessons and situations she endured with tenacity would help her navigate the circumstances she unknowingly would encounter later in life. War, marriage, family, life before the list. My grandfather, Imre István Obendorfer, born in 1923 in Budapest, was the youngest child of Gisela Salma Nagy Obendorfer and Joseph Obendorfer. My grandfather, Imre, was Gisela and Joseph's only child together, but there were stepbrothers and stepsisters that connected all of the siblings. He was born and raised in Budapest, and he was very proud of his well-rounded city life. He was a skilled machinist, he played on a local soccer team, and he was reportedly a very talented dancer in the social dance halls. My grandfather also loved to share stories about his life in Hungary, but they were less detailed about his younger life. His stories were more about his time during World War II, which he was lucky enough to survive despite the brutality of the war itself and a brief stint in a Russian prisoner of war camp. Most of the stories he loved to share were about his life after he met my grandmother. My grandfather Imre was 5 years older than my grandmother, and they met after World War II. He had become friends with one of my grandmother's older brothers, whom he had met while fighting in the war. Afterwards, they went back to Detsk, and he was introduced to my grandmother. Soon thereafter, in November of 1946, when my grandmother had just turned 18 years old and my grandfather was 23, they were married in Detsk in the church located a few blocks from my grandmother's family home. The wedding of Imre and Gisela in the village of Detk was the source of many stories that my grandparents would share, as it was a time of happiness for not only them, but their families and the world around them. The entire village was invited to the wedding, and everyone cooked for the celebration of their union. There was plenty of wine from the winery, and the music and celebration lasted until morning. There was always a sense of pride that shone through my grandmother's words when she told these stories. Strangely, with all of the pictures that my grandmother brought with her from Hungary, a picture of her wedding was missing. When I asked her why she didn't bring a picture from such a celebratory occasion, her answer was that of a typical sibling squabble. She didn't like the way her sister fixed her hair for the wedding, so she didn't want any pictures of herself to remember the hairstyle. What I wouldn't do to have that picture today. In 1947, almost a year to the day after my grandparents were married, they welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Gisela, after my grandmother and my great-grandmother. Sadly, 6 months after her birth, she died of pneumonia. This tragic event prompted my grandfather to immediately move back to Budapest with my grandmother so they would never be too far from a modern hospital if any of their future children should ever fall ill. In April of 1949, my father, Imre Joseph Obendorfer, later to be known as James, was born in Budapest, and my grandparents were filled with joy and an overprotective nature to keep my father safe and healthy. My grandparents spent 7 happy years living in their home in the 11th district and thriving in Budapest after the birth of my father. My grandfather still had his solid government job working for the railroad as a machinist, and my grandmother also had the opportunity to join the workforce as a modern woman because my grandfather's tanti, or aunt, lived with them and helped care for my father. My grandparents lived fulfilling and happy lives, working and socializing, although they were unhappy with the politics of the time under the communist regime. I hope you enjoyed the first part of story time from my family story that is written in Hungarian roots and American dreams. Stay tuned for part 2. Thanks for joining me on this episode of the Hungarian Heritage Podcast. Thanks for letting me share my family's immigration story. Part 2 of my family's story will be released shortly. My story, along with many others, can be found in the book Hungarian Roots and American Dreams, and I will leave information in the show notes if you're interested in purchasing a copy in English or in Hungarian. If you have feedback or questions about this episode, or you would like to connect with me at the podcast, you will also find that information in the show notes. If you've enjoyed this episode and you're interested in learning more about this Hungarian heritage community, please do not hesitate to reach out. I would love to hear from you. Our theme music is Hungarian Dance by Pony Music, used with special license from Envato Market. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, make sure you stay Hungarian heritage strong. Sziasztok!